Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Julia Durante Martinez, and I'm a program officer for community research and impact at LISC, one of the co-authors of the paper, the Gambling with Homes report that we're hosting this webinar in connection with. And are really excited to have this group of powerful organizers and housing researchers here today to reflect on the corporate consolidation of housing, speculation, its harmful impacts on Black, Indigenous communities of color, and poor and working class communities, as well as pathways forward to expand community control and social housing. So just, quickly by way of framing, of course, throughout the pandemic, tenant leaders and organizers and advocates have been sounding the alarm about the unfolding evictions crisis and the real risk of a investor consolidation of distressed housing in the wake of the pandemic. And folks mobilized for historic eviction moratoria and emergency rental assistance that had, through many months of the pandemic, staved off the worst of that. But of course, now we know that after the US Supreme Court held that the pandemic eviction moratorium was illegal, evictions increased 20%, particularly in jurisdictions that didn't have local protections. Rents are up as much as 40% in cities around the country, and predatory equity and other investors are operating in settings from manufactured housing to multifamily apartments to single family rentals. And so combating the evictions crisis that's unfolding nationwide requires centering tenant needs and tenant organizing, as well as identifying the market forces and actors that are really driving a lot of this displacement. And so that's what we are focusing on in today's webinar. So we're going to hear presentations from each of our panelists about their work and some of the really groundbreaking research and campaigns that they've been leading. And then we will have some time at the end for Q&A. So encourage folks to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will take those at the end of the webinar. So with that, I am going to turn it over to David Greenberg, the lead author of the LISC UNHP report, for a presentation.
Thanks so much, Julia, and everyone for joining. I'm David Greenberg. As Julia said, I'm the Vice President for Community Research and Impact at LISC National. I use he, him pronouns. Just grateful to Julia for moderating, and thanks to Samantha, Amy, Liesl, and Wanda for sharing their powerful work and experiences on this webinar. So my role is just to tee up their insights by sharing some important new findings that we really feel align with what many tenants and their advocates have been experiencing about the harm caused by housing speculation and financialization, and also the protective power of affordable housing investments. So I'm going to present a very quick overview of findings, but you can find both the full analyses and a summary report on the LISC website, a link to which should go out to everyone after the webinar. So upfront, I want to acknowledge quickly the paper's co-authors, including Julia, but especially recognize how this project builds off of the groundbreaking work of our collaborators at the University Neighborhood Housing Program in the Bronx, who, as part of their leadership, analyzing connection between housing finance and housing justice, have since the early 2000s maintained a database of the sales price and debt that is associated with privately held apartment buildings of 5 or greater units throughout New York City, which is linked, among other things, to housing maintenance violations that the city has reported. Next slide, please. So the urgency of this webinar and research is obviously, as Julia said, the confluence of the rising risks of evictions that are being felt around the country, and also an understanding of the market actors and forces that are mobilizing to profit from tenant crises. And though the research does use New York City as a case study, as Julia said, it really is a nationwide story in terms of rents rising, eviction filings rising, and the number of predatory investors who are operating at different scales all over the country. In order to address the root causes of the ongoing housing crisis, it is critical to understand tenant experiences, certainly, and to center them, but also to understand the market forces that are driving evictions and poor housing quality, and that's just what this research explores. Next slide, please. So we built on UNHP's longitudinal database to create a quantitative measure of how quickly an apartment building rose in sales price, and also how much additional debt was taken on when an owner refinanced. And so as many people on this webinar know, refinancing mortgages to take on more and generally cheap debt and then using those funds for more profitable investments has become a very important way that speculators realize their profits. We then use this measure of speculation to ask questions about where the greatest returns have been realized, what the consequences of those returns have been to tenants in terms of housing quality and eviction rates. And building off of a database of subsidized housing from NYU's Furman Center, we also explore the impact of affordable housing investments in promoting positive outcomes for tenants. Next slide, please. So our first finding, really unsurprising for many people on this call, is that speculation was statistically more likely to occur in lower income Black and Latinx neighborhoods that saw signs of gentrification, more likely there than it was to occur in whiter, wealthier areas. In other words, the greatest returns on investment during the time period that we looked at from 2003 to 2020 were realized not in the ultra wealthy areas of Manhattan, but in places like the Bronx, whose child poverty rate is about 40%. Next slide, please. So second, extracting these profits from buildings demonstrably harmed the tenants who lived there. So buildings that appreciated the quickest in value, which in our research was a threshold of at least about 30% annually for sales and about 50% annually for debt, had up to 2.7 times the number of housing maintenance violations. And they also successfully evicted tenants at 1.5 times the rate of similar buildings in similar neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So unsurprisingly, these are the same neighborhoods that advocates have been drawing attention to for some time, which have been hit hardest by predatory equity, by evictions, and by COVID death rates. Next slide. So third, on a much more positive note, despite the stereotype, of being poorly maintained, affordable housing had fewer maintenance violations on the whole than unsubsidized units. And that's even taking into account luxury housing and new construction. In some cases, they had up to 3/4 fewer violations in some places, depending on the year. They were also less likely to be acquired at higher values or to take on higher debt levels than properties in similar neighborhoods, which really means that they were removed from the speculative market while the subsidy was in place. And just to note that this database involves privately held housing, so it didn't include the New York City Housing Authority. Next slide, yeah, please. So based on these analyses, we make recommendations that are related to tenant protections, to resources for acquisition, to bring housing into community and nonprofit ownership, around code enforcement and ownership transfer, around taxation to curb speculation, and also address lending-related regulatory policy. But stepping back, and our panelists will talk about this more, the primary finding that speculation leads to eviction is really not news to folks on this call, and certainly not to the panelists. But even as we center the needs of tenants and BIPOC communities in the looming potential eviction crisis, we really want to draw attention to the fact that those who have profited most from recent housing market trends are also the ones who have done the most harm. And the second thing is that we really want to draw attention to the fact that solutions that advocates have been proposing have resulted in better outcomes for tenants and to communities. So look forward to questions toward the end of the call and to hearing from my fellow panelists about their critical work. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, David. So now we're going to pass the mic to Samantha Katan, a Senior Research Analyst at the Action Center on Race and the Economy, who's going to share some of their new research on the corporate consolidation of housing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia and David and the team at LISC for having me. So yeah, again, my name is Samantha Katan. I'm based in New York City. I am the Senior Research Analyst at ACRE, Action Center on Race and the Economy. You can go to the next slide. So a really quick overview of ACRE. So the Action Center on Race and the Economy is a campaign hub for organizations working at the intersection of racial justice and Wall Street accountability. We provide research and communications infrastructure and strategic support for organizations working on campaigns to win structural change by directly taking on the financial elite that are responsible for pillaging communities of color, devastating working class communities, and harming our environment. Within ACRE, our housing team supports grassroots groups around the country who are fighting for housing justice by targeting corporate landlords and their political power. Next slide. So what is a corporate landlord? At ACRE, we consider a corporate landlord to be any company that owns housing and operates with a corporate decision-making model. So with a focus on ever-increasing profits through growing their portfolio and or finding ways to cut costs. The phrase is sometimes used interchangeably with institutional investor because many corporate landlords get financing from institutions like pensions. So while there are many landlords who we would consider corporate landlords who maybe only own 10 or 20 buildings, not thousands of buildings, there are dozens of very large scale corporate landlords in the US who collectively own millions of apartments and homes, who have CEOs who are among the richest people in the world, and who are able to influence housing policy to benefit their bottom line. So in line with the data-based findings in the Gambling with Homes report related to speculation, ACRE has definitely seen in talking with tenants in these kinds of portfolios that the largest corporate landlords are associated with worse housing conditions, higher eviction rates, steep rent hikes, and fees that get passed on to tenants. So I'll give an example of that in a moment. Next slide. So this is my attempt at distilling the rise of corporate consolidation in housing into 1 or 2 slides. So until recently, the majority of rental housing across the country was actually owned by individuals, or what we call mom and pop landlords. Starting in the 1990s, corporations really started to buy more and more housing due in part to changes in tax laws, particularly in relation to real estate investment trusts or REITs that made investment in real estate more favorable and more profitable. This trend accelerated hugely in the wake of the 2008 foreclosure crisis. The crisis resulted in millions of homeowners losing their homes. This disproportionately impacted Black and Latino homeowners. And this moment represented an opportunity for large investors, including many private equity-backed groups, to quickly purchase thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of homes and buildings at reduced prices. So suddenly at this time, you're seeing companies really scale up and get to portfolio sizes in the tens of thousands. This was happening in both single family and multifamily housing. And importantly, this was very much overlapping with the areas that were hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis. Next slide. We saw that trend continue through the 2010s. And then in 2020, the pandemic brought even more corporate investment in housing. We've seen a lot of headlines over the past couple of years. I think one of these headlines was also on one of David's slides. So we've seen a lot of headlines over the last couple of years about how much money private equity groups have on hand to invest in real estate in general, including housing. And there's been increased scrutiny on the accelerated corporate consolidation within the single family rental industry. Next slide. So just a few stats on where we're at currently. So within all rental housing, by 2018, the share of the country's rental housing stock owned by individuals had fallen to just over 40%, meaning that a plurality was owned by corporate vehicles for the first time in history. So 2018 was kind of the tipping point. Within multifamily housing specifically, the largest 50 multifamily landlords who are in the National Multifamily Housing Council collectively own about 2.5 million apartment units across the country. And within single family homes, which is a newer arena for large scale corporate investment, last year, investors bought nearly 1 in 7 homes sold across the country's top metro areas. And in cities like Atlanta, Georgia, and Charlotte, North Carolina, fully 25% of homes were bought by investors last year. A really quick side note here, the terms investors and corporate vehicles are pretty general and include a broader swath of owners than what we would consider corporate landlords. But considering that large-scale corporate ownership of housing is a relatively recent phenomenon, as I just outlined, and has really only continued to grow since it began, we expect that this will continue to move in a direction of increased consolidation. Next slide. I also quickly wanted to share this map. It shows at a glance where the 4 largest single-family rental landlords, who collectively own almost 200,000 units of housing, have concentrated their portfolios. They really overlap again with where the foreclosure crisis hit hardest. Florida, Georgia, and Texas have really large footprints. Atlanta alone has over 23,000 units of single-family rentals. And I want to give a quick shout out to the researcher Desiree Fields, who included this map in her testimony to the Senate Banking Committee during a hearing about how private equity landlords are shaping the housing market. Next slide. So all of this together is basically what people mean when they talk about the financialization of housing and the idea that housing is primarily understood as an investment vehicle and not something that is a basic need or a human right. On the left here, I pulled in a page from a pamphlet called Multifamily Housing, a Primer for Offshore Investors from the real estate company CBRE. I just thought it was a funny way to illustrate how people's homes are understood as profit makers in the world of investment. Next slide. I wanted to zoom in on one example of a large-scale corporate landlord that feels like a good illustration of their business models and how they're impacting tenants. And this is one that might be less familiar to folks who are based in New York City. So Pretium Partners and their subsidiaries, Progress Residential and Havenbrook Homes, own approximately 80,000 single-family rental homes across the country, and they're growing very rapidly. They have been increasing their portfolio by an average of 2,000 homes a month. And they were one of the corporate landlords that maybe folks had heard about when they bought big chunks of Zillow's home portfolio when Zillow decided to exit the house flipping and iBuying business last year. One fact about Pretium is that their founder and CEO, Don Mullen, is a former Goldman Sachs executive who notoriously led a team of mortgage brokers to bet against the mortgage market in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. And then he quickly turned around and founded this real estate investment company that has been able to reap very large profits from the fallout of that crisis. I could definitely devote several slides to complaints that tenants have raised against Pretium and their subsidiaries. My colleague, Sophia Lopez, also at ACRE, included several stories from tenants in her testimony to the Senate Banking Committee in October, including complaints of poor customer service, patchwork repairs, and a strategy of passing costs and fees onto tenants. In February of this year, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison filed a lawsuit against Pretium and Havenbrook Homes for, quote, shameful, deceptive, and fraudulent practices in failing to repair and maintain their rental homes. Next slide. It's also important to highlight how these landlords are not only influential because of their large portfolios, they're also highly organized. They lobby together and put out press narratives through landlord trade groups such as the National Multifamily Housing Council, the National Apartment Association and its state and local affiliates, and the National Rental Home Council. Earlier this week, ACRE and the Center for Popular Democracy and the Private Equity Stakeholder Project co-launched a report about the National Rental Home Council, the trade group that represents mostly corporate single-family rental landlords. We highlighted how this group pushes a narrative that the increased presence of corporations in single-family housing is a good thing because it, quote, professionalizes the industry, while very much obscuring the many issues that tenants in their members' portfolios have directly experienced. Next slide. So I know the two other panelists are going to talk more about the possible solutions to this trend and this crisis, but I'll mention a few. We know that we want to restrict corporate control of housing by enacting anti-speculation taxes and regulations, and by enacting landlord registries that would require disclosure of who owns what housing. We want to restrict the influence of the landlord lobby on housing policy, in part by asking our elected officials to pledge to not accept money from real estate interests. And we want to pass stronger tenant protection so that no matter who owns our homes, tenants can feel secure knowing that we have the right to a lease renewal, a right to controlled rent increases, right to counsel, and opportunities to gain ownership of our housing. So I think that's all I have time for now. My email is on this slide. I'm always happy to talk with folks that are doing work on the ground across the country targeting corporate landlords. So feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. And now we're going to hear from Amy Chu, a senior research analyst at the Center for Popular Democracy, who's going to share findings from a really great new report that they just put out focused on social housing.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to LISC for organizing this event, and it's an honor to be here with all my fellow panelists. I am Amy Chu, a senior research analyst at the Center for Popular Democracy, and the author and lead researcher of a report called Social Housing for All, a vision for thriving communities, rental power, and racial justice, which was produced together with Renters Rising, and it's available in both English and Spanish. We'll send out the links later. So just really quick, the Center for Popular Democracy is a national nonprofit working to create a dynamic democracy in partnership with high impact base building organizations, alliances, and unions. We work with 53 affiliates and partners in 131 cities across 34 states, Puerto Rico and DC, and we have a housing justice cohort of about 12 organizations. Next slide, please. Renters Rising is a national alliance of renters working to shift the balance of power between renters and corporate landlords to guarantee that renters are able to live with dignity. We're organizing thousands of renters of corporate landlords across the country to hold them accountable. And this is a picture from an action we had earlier this week at the National Rental Homes Council conference. So I'm going to talk about our new report around social housing, particularly how we define social housing, as well as policy recommendations. But next slide, please. So Samantha already gave a really great overview about the current crisis of corporate control in our housing system. So we believe that for-profit investors and for-profit landlords are at the root of our country's housing affordability crisis. A corporate stranglehold over all aspects of our housing system is driving our rising and unaffordable housing costs, whether that's in single-family homes, multifamily homes, and now we have landlords like Blackstone buying 90,000 units of government-subsidized affordable housing also. So next slide. So social housing is a sensible, effective, and proven solution to these problems. We define social housing as a public option for housing that is permanently affordable, protected from the private market, and publicly owned or under democratic community control. As housing justice organizations of low-income renters across the country, we see social housing as socially owned, meaning it is owned by the public through government entities or by nonprofits like cooperatives and community land trusts that ensure community control. Permanently affordable, meaning it is deeply affordable for the building's entire life. permanently decommodified, meaning the role of for-profit investors is minimized and social housing cannot be privatized or transferred to for-profit ownership. Socially financed, produced, and maintained, meaning it's financed through public funds and not for-profit entities like public banks. It is built and maintained by the public sector or nonprofits employing union labor and worker cooperatives. And last but not least, under democratic community control. It is developed, owned, managed, and operated through entities that are democratically accountable to the public, residents, and communities. Residents should have a direct role in management and decision-making. Tenant unions should have recognized bargaining rights to help govern housing conditions and rents, ensuring accountability to low-income residents. Next slide. So we must face the fact that for-profit developers and for-profit landlords are incapable of producing the affordable housing that we need. They cannot produce affordable housing at scale. They do not create deeply affordable housing. As this graph shows, the for-profit sector is increasingly just catering to the highest income individuals. Next slide. Yet since the 1970s, our federal and state governments have slashed funding for affordable housing while providing tax breaks for corporate landlords. Next slide. And as this graph shows, what the government spends on housing for the rich through tax deductions, in fact, far exceeds its spending on housing for low-income people. Next slide. Our lack of affordable housing is a problem created by the real estate industry, corporate landlords, and government misaction. The solution is to change the role and responsibility of government in our housing supply. Our report on social housing lays out how, featuring successful proven examples from around the world. Most importantly, our report spells out how to create social housing that puts renter power and racial justice at the center to ensure policy truly uplifts low-income communities of color. In doing so, we can transform deep-seated historical inequities, we can expand racial and gender justice, and we can actually end mass homelessness by increasing housing affordability for all. Next slide. So one of the things we wanted to celebrate in our report is that social housing works. It's the only way we think to produce the sheer amount of affordable housing we need. Examples show that government-led construction of social housing has succeeded in creating massive amounts of deeply affordable housing where the private sector has failed. Upfront public financing for public construction of social housing under government or nonprofit ownership is the effective way forward, not tax breaks to private developers and investors, which is what we currently rely on now. Social housing, implemented according to our definition, expands renter power, bringing much needed accountability and increased democracy to our housing market. When renters have more political leverage, they can advance policies that protect everyone from speculators, profiteers, and market instability. And finally, as I'll elaborate, social housing promotes racial justice. Next slide. So in our vision for social housing, we prioritize the lowest income residents and communities of color. This means expanding quality, accessible public housing under resident management. Public housing, social housing, which is publicly owned and affordable to the poorest, is critical for ensuring housing options exist for the lowest income households. But we must redress our country's history of racist neglect and punitive treatment of residents in public housing. The federal government must repair, green, and modernize our existing public housing stock and expand public housing construction to create high-quality homes under genuine democratic management by residents. Extremely low-income households, especially Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant households, are the most excluded and have the least options in our current housing system. So to guarantee social housing is deeply affordable for all, social housing must prioritize the needs of lower-income residents and communities of color first, even as we aim for a scale that will cover everyone in need and more. Next slide, please. Which brings us to our principles for social housing as follows. These are laid out in the report, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'd just like to highlight especially scale. So public investment, we think, should create social housing at scale. So it is a significant proportion of our housing stock because evidence shows that robust social housing brings down housing prices across the whole market when there's enough of it to quote unquote compete with private landlords. Again, housing production led by the private sector is failing to provide the affordable housing we need. So we do not advocate just expanding private for-profit construction. which caters to high-income renters and wastes government subsidies on private profits. Instead, only public sector preservation, construction, and acquisition can meet our needs at scale. So another principle I want to highlight is racial and gender justice. So social housing is a form of wealth redistribution that furthers racial and gender equity. It can be sited in well-resourced neighborhoods to promote desegregation and expand access, while in low-income communities, it can counter displacement and help build community wealth. As a foundation of successful efforts to end homelessness, social housing offers reparations. Money spent on overblown police or prison budgets should be redirected towards ending homelessness and providing deeply affordable housing that is accessible to the lowest income residents of color, people with records, and people regardless of immigration status. Towards these ends, social housing must prioritize resourcing low-income communities of color and put marginalized communities at the center of decision-making. And then university and accessibility while prioritizing the most marginalized is an important principle. Again, we believe that social housing at scale should be universally available to all low and moderate income households who seek it. But as mentioned to begin with, production and preservation should first prioritize marginalized groups who have the greatest need in the housing market, including the lowest income households, people of color, women-headed households, families of children, LGBTQ people, people living with disability, seniors, immigrants, unhoused people, people with records, and others. And then as you can see, climate justice, solidarity, economics, and more are also core principles which the report discusses. Next slide, please. So how can these principles be actualized? We provide detailed policy recommendations where at their heart, we must protect every step of creating affordable housing from for-profit investors and speculators. From land acquisition to financing, from construction and maintenance, each step of creating and actualizing affordable housing must be protected from speculation and profiteering. In the US, our government policy now largely waits until the last stage of the housing production pipeline before intervening to improve affordability for the lowest income residents. This approach is far less effective than intervening at earlier points of housing production and preservation. As this diagram shows, the government can provide low-cost land through public land banking and leasing. It can ensure public financing that counters our dependence on Wall Street investors through public grants, low-interest loans, and public banking. It can ensure preservation, construction, and maintenance employing union labor and worker cooperatives. Next slide. So Finland is the only country in the European Union where homelessness is decreasing, and it is on track to eradicate homelessness by 2027, despite the pandemic, actually. So Finland is famous for its quote-unquote housing first policy, which gives unhoused people an apartment and counseling as soon as they need them with no preconditions. But Finland also has a strong social housing program that ensures affordable homes are available to begin with. As this diagram shows, Finland's public bank finances most social housing development. The city government owns most land in Helsinki, which it leases for creating social housing. A public construction company builds social housing, and local government owns most social housing. Next slide. Finland's social housing is high quality. Many apartments for housing first beneficiaries are 1 or 2 bedroom with amenities like private balconies, a gym room, and a sauna. Next slide, please. This chart shows how the US government's investment in affordable housing lags far behind other wealthy countries. Vienna, Austria ranks as a city with the highest quality of life in the world. It's famous for its robust social housing and has among the lowest rents in Europe. Vienna has nearly 20 times the amount of public and subsidized housing as Philadelphia, a city of roughly similar size. Helsinki, Finland has over 10 times the amount of public housing as Detroit. And while 16% of Finland's housing stock is social housing, only 4% of homes in the US are subsidized affordable housing, much of it in fact owned by for-profit landlords. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to uplift that from 1965 to 1975, Sweden built over 1 million quality public housing units, which brought affordable housing within the reach of its whole population after facing an extreme crisis and an affordable housing shortage, and it raised the living standards of an entire generation. So in Sweden, the National Tenants Union has annual negotiations with landlord organizations to set rent increases in both public and private housing stock to a government recognized process. Swedish rents increased an average of just 0.8 to 2.8% annually in the past decade. Next slide. So our report outlines the following actionable steps that policymakers can take with tenants and community members to move towards a robust social housing system. So first is support a national tenants union with recognized bargaining rights. And in San Francisco, there was a victory where tenants won the right to bargain with their landlords mandatorily. And then secondly, support social housing and public banking legislation at the state and local levels. So for example, in California, tenant organizations and labor unions are calling for $1 billion in the state budget to fund a social housing accelerator initiative that would preserve buildings as permanently affordable social housing for low and moderate income households. On the federal level, repeal the Faircloth Amendment, which limits new public housing construction, and support a Green New Deal for housing. So we're supporting Representative Ilhan Omar's Homes for All Act, which was reintroduced this past March, that would allocate $1 trillion over 10 years to build 12 million new permanently affordable public and social housing units. Next, use public land for permanently affordable housing and establish public land banking and leasing programs for that purpose. Expand community land trust and cooperative housing. There are many great examples across the US of that, which I won't go into now. Strengthen rent control and tenant protections. We really see tenant protections as core to also combating the corporate control of housing. So in New York, advocates are seeking a good cause eviction bill that includes a mechanism for tenants to challenge rent increases that are above 1.5 times the consumer price index. In Maryland, groups are also fighting to pass anti-rent gouging laws in different localities. And in this past November, residents of St. Paul, Minnesota passed the strongest rent stabilization ordinance in the country via ballot measure. It just went into effect May 1st, and it caps rent increases at 3% annually and applies even if tenants move out. So even in between tenancies. And then next, rein in speculation and corporate landlords. So from enacting transparency requirements and anti-speculation taxes to repealing the opportunity zones tax break under Trump and ending federal support for private equity landlords, there's a lot we can do to directly counter the corporate control of housing. And then finally, divest from harm, invest in care, and punitive policies against renters and subsidize and public housing while redirecting funds from militarization towards deeply affordable housing. So efforts in these areas are underway across the country, and they should be expanded and supported. Next slide. So yeah, the transformations we envision, social housing for all, require massive government investment and a shift in government priorities, especially given the racist history of the housing market and austerity of our economic system. They require the redirection of funds from subsidizing corporate landlords and the wealthiest billionaires, as well as from institutions that harm and criminalize our communities, towards increased resources for permanently affordable housing. The far-reaching societal benefits are well worth it. The construction and maintenance of social housing will create union jobs. By ensuring everyone has a home, widespread social housing will help improve educational attainment, workforce development, and public health. Savings to residents will build community wealth, boost local economies, and increase racial and gender justice. And our country has the resources and every reason to expand social housing as a foundation for thriving communities, well-being, and human potential. So I just want to end by saying we can end homelessness like Finland. We can provide affordable housing for all who need it. And so we must provide social housing for all. And the last slide is just my contact info. And thank you again.
Thanks so much, Amy. And now we're going to turn it over to Liesl Coleman, the lead organizer with the Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester, and Wanda Cooper, a tenant leader there, to close us out by talking about the amazing organizing and campaign work they're doing.
Hey everyone, I'm so happy to see so many of you on this call. We're really happy to be here from New York, you know, the Citywide Tenant Union. I'm Liesl,
And I'm Wanda Cooper.
So Wanda is one of our tenant leaders in the Citywide Tenant Union. She's going to tell a little bit about her story in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to kick us off by talking about how the Citywide Tenant Union was formed. And it's really in line with what everybody has been saying, especially related to the foreclosure crisis. So during the foreclosure crisis, our founding member of the Citywide Tenants Union, LISC McGriff, if you can go to the next slide, please. We got a little TV in the background. This is a picture of Wanda Cooper, or excuse me, of Liz McGriff winning back her home from the bank. They resisted her foreclosure a number of different times, pushing back, forcing the bank to sell the property back to Liz for 10% of the market value. And this is really where the energy for the Citywide Tenant Union came out of. And we established Rochester's first community land trust, the Cityroots Community Land Trust, in 2017, as well as the Citywide Tenant Union. So since then, the Citywide Tenant Union has been a grassroots organization promoting housing as a human right. Next slide, please. Our mission is to elevate housing to a human right and securing community control over land and housing. And we do this by building tenant power, but also fighting for progressive policies that make the reality that we want of community control happen. So the Citywide Tenant Union has been involved with a variety of different unions in the past, including winning a full renovation of a 50+ unit building. But it wasn't until recently that the Cityroots Land Trust was established enough to take over properties that we had organizing drives to pursue. So if we could go to the next slide, please. You know, the model of the Citywide Tenants Union is really empowering tenant leaders in order to make the decisions that are right for themselves and their family by coming together with their neighbors and other tenants under similar landlords in order to fight back on this crazy system that everyone's been talking about all day. So Wanda's going to give a little bit of an overview now of what her slumlord was like and how she came to be in the position of moving towards owning her property with the Cityroots Land Trust.
Well, I'm Wanda Cooper. I moved in from West Palm Beach, Florida, and I liked it so much. It was so beautiful. I decided to move here, and I brought my family along with me. We came across this landlord. We all got apartments in the same building so we could be close together. But after we moved in, we started noticing issues. My daughter had a leak in her roof that was draining in water. We had mold up under the sink that was covered under a carpet. We had toilets moving. We had rodents, infestation. We would call the landlord, nobody would come. Then we would keep calling, nobody would come. But he would be on time to pick up the rent, but he would never come into the building. We would always have to meet him outside. So he started sending people over to say they're gonna fix things. So with the leak in the sink, he took zip ties and zip tied the sink up. And I was telling them that's only gonna make it worse because once those zip ties break, the issue's gonna get worse. So again, he wouldn't come, he wouldn't fix anything. So I called the net office, I called code enforcement, which they already knew of the issues. He had violation for years on it. I found out he didn't have a CFO, he wasn't supposed to rent the property. It was so many issues and we couldn't get from under the issues that was going on, but we couldn't move because we didn't have anywhere to go. So I met Miss Liesel and we started fighting together against this landlord. We started picking in his house. We started picking in front of the courthouse. We started having rallies until we got heard. When we got heard, they started doing court dates to get him in to see what was going on. And finally, we evicted the landlord. We put him out. So Land Trust stepped in and purchased the property and they're doing renovations now. They're getting the codes there, and they're giving us an opportunity to purchase our building from them so we can have a permanent home that we love and we're stable. We don't have to move anywhere. We're basically happy now. And I just wanted to put that out there because if it wasn't for them, we don't know where we would be.
Thank you, Wanda, for sharing that. And
Thank you.
yeah, next slide, please. So this is a picture of Wanda's there in the orange, and her granddaughter Doodles calling at a rally to evict our slumlord. And that's actually the name of our organizing program, the Evict Our Slumlord Organizing Program. And that has a couple of different phases. Next slide, please. So like Wanda talked about, we went through a bunch of different escalating steps to force her slumlord to sell the properties. And all of those things include really detailed planning and research. So we look at who are the top code violators in the city of Rochester and go after them. That's how I had the absolute pleasure of ending up to meet Miss Wanda here. Sal Malik was in the top 5 slumlords in the city of Rochester. And then from there, it's really about leadership development and tenant empowerment, pulling tenants together to form a union, making collective decisions together about escalating against this landlord by, like Wanda said, going to his house, getting him taken to court, putting pressure on his social circles, and continuing to create strategic disruption that brings attention to the issue. And finally, phase 4, what we're most proud of and we're most happy about is reclaiming community control. So taking these properties from slumlords who don't have any care about this community, don't want to invest in it, don't want to invest in the people, and bringing it to a mission-driven nonprofit like the Cityroots Land Trust, that really their goal is community control and permanent affordability of land. Next slide, please. So our organizing program helps to unveil issues that are common to tenants across the community. And we use that in order to create effective policy campaigns so that it's going to make this evict our slumlord process easier and make it more possible for more tenants to take control of their housing and land. We have a incredible statewide coalition, Housing Justice for All, where we work with upstate and downstate New Yorkers to pass bills that are going to affect New York State tenants across the board. Right now, it's almost the end of our session. We are running to force these legislators to pass good cause eviction protections, which would, prevent against no cause evictions, which we see all the time. And we are pushing for the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act that would give tenants the first right of refusal on a sale of the property, the ability to try and own their property, to have that first option to purchase the property. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see really all of our statewide priorities, good cause eviction protections, which I mentioned, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, the Tenant Dignity and Safe Housing Act, which allows tenants to proactively sue their landlord for health and safety violations, and statewide right to counsel to keep people in our homes, because we know that when tenants have adequate defense from eviction, they are way less likely to get evicted. So just to round out our conversation, I wanted to give an example of what we're doing on the statewide level. Last week, we headed down to Albany, New York, our state capital. We had 1,000+ people from across the state of New York. We had 50 people who got arrested, shutting down the Assembly and Senate chambers, demanding that our legislators listen to us about the policy solutions that tenants are putting forward, because tenants know best what they need in their own situations. So now we're hearing a little bit of movement on the bill. So everyone keep your fingers crossed for us for good cause eviction protections and other measures passing in New York State this year. So we're so thankful for LISC for having us and giving us the opportunity to share some of our energy about social housing and reclaiming community control. And if folks have questions about organizing and building tenants unions, I'm going to drop my email in the chat for folks to reach out. You want to add anything else?
I just thank y'all for giving us the opportunity to tell our story and let everybody know if you stick together and fight, change can happen.
That's right. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liesl and Wanda, for that powerful presentation. Also, always reiterating the importance of building community power, tenant organizing, to be able to undercut speculation and expand community control over land and housing. So I see we have a lot of questions and comments and some lively discussion in the chat, which is great, and some questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to start with this first Q&A question. How could TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, be extended or fortified as an effective tool against privatization? So I don't, maybe Lisa and Wanda, if you want to speak about why you're fighting for TOPA, and then Amy, if you want to chime in after that too, feel free.
The reason I'm fighting for TOPA is, like I said, I moved my whole family up here because it was so beautiful. And TOPA would keep people from losing their home. This is the only place we know. And if we move somewhere else, it's like, wow, I don't know where I'm at, and starting over. By having TOPA in place, we're home, we can stay home, and we can make it our home, legally purchase the building and stay stable. We don't have to worry about, oh, if we move here, we're gonna get evicted, or if we move here, the environment is not gonna be right for my grandchildren. Due to having TOPA in place, where you are and feel at home, you can stay home.
Yeah, I would just add, you know, that's so right. I mean, we want people to be able to stay in their homes, to own their homes, to take them away from extractive landlords. And you know, Wanda's situation, we had to fight so hard to force this landlord to sell the property.
Yeah.
If we had something like TOPA in place, where the first right of refusal would have to go to the tenants, as opposed to us having to do crazy things like, you know, handing out flyers to his neighbors, then this would just really solidify the ability for tenants to take over their properties and claim community control.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. It's a really important point of leverage for tenants who are organizing. And it's just important too that the TOPA policy includes enough time, like at least 6 months or more, as the window for the first, for the window that tenants can, or residents can be allowed to purchase the property, to give them enough time to get everything together and all the money needed. And it's good too if it's paired with just sort of like other pipeline support from the government. Like sometimes it comes with policies that also provide funding to help with those purchases too. So that's important.
Oh, I think there's some follow-up to that question, which is about the potential to get federal subsidies for tenants to afford purchasing, especially since some organizations do mortgage TOPA deals but have trouble competing with other buyers. All right, I'm going to go to the next question. Are there resources to help municipalities create their own databases to understand how speculation is playing out at the local level and who our predatory investors are? And if anyone is working on local solutions for jurisdictions in GOP majority states where we need enabling legislation to enact many of the recommended policy solutions, which can mean that they're non-options in the current political and legal landscape. Don't know who wants to respond to their first question about creating databases of property research. Samantha, maybe your thoughts?
Yeah, I can jump in there. One possible resource that I want to lift up is a group that's based in New York City called Just Fix, that I know has worked with at least maybe one other municipality on putting together a database of just more generally, like using already publicly accessible data, kind of making the connection between registered addresses of like landlords and LLC names, and like using data algorithms to piece together an idea of like the full portfolio that a landlord owns. So definitely building from that kind of information, you can get to, it's much easier to do the kind of research that you need to do to get a sense of who the largest landlords are. Justfix.nyc And then the portfolio research website, who owns what.justfix.nyc, is a really wonderful example of how you can use data that's already publicly accessible technically, but kind of hard to piece together, and make it searchable and very usable by anyone. So I think they would be happy to talk with anyone that's interested in pursuing a project locally. I guess another thing I want to say on that is I think one of the biggest barriers with this kind of thing is it's so different county to county, state to state, city to city, of like what is required for landlords to disclose. So I think, a lot of what I'm interested in personally is organizing that's happening around more public disclosure of ownership.
Yeah, I just want to add on, like, there's a great need for more transparency, like Samantha said, and like Renters Rising, like one of the things we are organizing around is that. But if you are interested in finding your local data and it doesn't exist, like assessors data is kind of like a main source. It tells, like, for tax purposes, all the owners, their addresses. A lot of corporate landlords hide behind LLCs, so you don't really know if it's like Blackstone or Putnam. But I will say in some of the red states, so we have affiliates who are in like Florida, Texas, North Carolina. I know I'm missing other ones that are part of Renters Rising. And in those states, the corporate landlords actually don't hide that well on assessors data. They're actually they actually go by names that are recognizable. So if you want more information about how to find them, like, feel free to reach out to me or Samantha. Sometimes they also publish on their own websites, like property listings of like ones that are empty or vacant that they own. And then from that, you can kind of match it up with the assessor's data to figure out the owners. Yeah, I think, sorry, I know there's a question about red states also and policies there, but yes, please feel free to reach out because we do have affiliates working in some of those states.
Thanks. And maybe just for the last question, before we wrap up, is how do you differentiate social housing from our current public housing system? That Amy wants to speak to that.
So we see public housing, which is government owned and affordable to the poorest, to the lowest income households, as like an essential part of social housing. But as we define social housing, we believe it needs to be high quality and under democratic community controls. So so we think that public housing is a kind of social housing, but that in the US it's like lacking in terms of financing and repairs and all that stuff. And the challenges around just like resident input also need to be addressed too. So yeah.
Thank you. And I see Samantha also just put some information about anti-speculation taxes in the chat, which I know there were a few questions about what that specifically looks like. And again, just to reiterate, we'll share out the slides, the recording, links to all of the reports and other resources that were mentioned in our presentations today. So I just want to thank all of our presenters again so much for all of your powerful presentations and work. And to everyone for joining and for engaging so deeply and thoughtfully in the chat. It's always really nice to see a lively chat on a webinar, and really hope that you will reach out to continue the discussion, since of course many of these are very live, very timely campaigns and policy issues, and we look forward to continuing to be in touch about the work. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.